Dynasty startup strategy, and in particular, what to do when you're in a league of like-minded managers. How can you manage that to your advantage? How should you try and position yourself in the draft when you know that it's going to be similar structure, similar player targets? And that is also what myself and Shawn are doing. We've talked about it over the last couple of weeks as we've built up to set it up. We have now set up a RotoViz Triflex $250 Dynasty League where it's myself and Shawn co-managing against 11 other teams. We do have one other co-managed team in that, and I did mention this on a show that's going to come out in the next couple of days. Myself and Shawn have a Superflex draft against the RotoViz OT community coming up here, and I did mention at a point in that two of the managers in this league actually struck up a friendship through one of those best ball drafts, Shawn, that we've done over the last couple of years. They've been co-managing some teams as a result of that, which I thought was a really cool and fun story. We're going to talk today a little bit about some of the strategies we may even have in that particular startup. We'll have some updates on that as we move through the weeks here and the teams get built up. But I think it's going to be a lot of fun, something that we've talked about for a long time, Shawn. We've never fully put together, but it's going to be exciting now to have this team as well, and to do it along with some of the members of the OT community. As I mentioned, that means that they are very like-minded in terms of player targets. Might also be very, very like-minded in terms of players they like to avoid. But Shawn, the thing that's so good about our community is it's not a case of just following blindly what is talked about on the show. We do get lots of questions about players that maybe we're not as enthusiastic about that other people are. So there will be some variance throughout all leagues, but I do think we'll have some lay or crossover between the players and the targets. So as we get ready to kick this one off, what angle do you want to take us in? What direction do you want to play with it here? I think it's going to be a fun conversation looking at some Superflex strategy here.
Colm, this is the best time of the year. We've got main events getting fired up. We've had folks share their early main event drafts with us. Obviously, we're still doing a lot of the FFPC Best Ball Superflex drafts. I'm currently in some of the BBT, the higher level regular best ball leagues with OT listeners. That is a lot of fun. But Dynasty Startups, once we get into NFL training camps, that may be the best version of fantasy football that you're going to ever experience. You get the camaraderie, you get the short-term and the long-term outlook. You have all of these trades as you're working through, and you're setting yourself up with a roster of players that you want to spend the next 3, 4, 10, 15 years with. And I think that part is really unrivaled in fantasy football, and I can't wait to do it with the OT community. Now, the main thing that we want here is for everyone to have a good time. And so that's going to be a pretty big emphasis. But we're also trying to win, right? It's a 250 entry. That is definitely nothing to sneeze at. And then the prizes, if you get a top 2 seed and you finish first, it's going to be $1,300. So, Colm, that will get, in the vicinity of funding a main event for the following year. We're going to try and win this. We drew the 105. That is a pretty good pick. I think the very first question that we have as we're looking at a Dynasty startup that is in the RotoViz Triflex format at the FFPC, where there are a lot of starters, it is Superflex, it is tight end premium. There are so many different ways you can go with roster building. You're trying to figure out if you want to stay put, if you're going to move down, what the appropriate price to move down is, and then if you should adjust your thinking based on the group that you're going to be with. So we talk all the time about perpetual reloading on the show. You're trying to create this permanent championship window. We know as a result that there is some likelihood that more managers are going to be looking to move down than maybe in a normal draft. Now, you usually get into these startups, Colm. My experience is that 1 or 2 participants are basically trying to sell every one of their picks, and they're trying to get as many first rounders for the next draft as possible. One of the things that I think can be interesting when you jump in there is that if you have a couple of managers who are completely and totally tanking every single part of year one, how do you still execute your move down? Because you're going to maybe be a little bit more tactical, even though by the end you're expecting to make the most total trades. And this is an element that becomes a lot of fun because you want to have more of those picks in that, say, round 5 through round 10 range than anybody else. You want to come out of, say, the first 8 or 9 rounds with more picks than any other team. And at the same time, you want to be building more future draft capital than any other team. That doesn't mean you're going to match exactly the teams that have been able to acquire, 4 first-round picks in the future, but you're going to have a more varied profile. Colm, what do you expect to have happen here in this group? Do you think we're going to see people be able to trade down? Now, we already have an interesting trade offer. It is below what I normally see for a move from the 105 to the 112. That's where the team is trying to move up from. And yet, the question we have to ask ourselves is, if everybody's wanting to move down, are we going to have interesting offers to come up? If we don't have offers that meet our usual standards for making that trade, do you still do the trade? Right? Because we'd like to move down, and yet the player values aren't going to necessarily move. If you're giving up more than you get, then you wouldn't necessarily do it. So many different small factors involved. Colm, what do you want to see us do in round 1?
Yeah, this is the part that makes the strategic element of it really fun because, when people send us questions or we talk about players, something that we do reference is from league to league. It's, going to depend on what that person is trying to achieve with that team or what they're willing to give up to get that player. And there's certain leagues then where you'll have a player who may have a value in a different dynasty league that you're in. If you're playing across dynasty leagues, that somebody wants, let's say, a running back or a veteran receiver, but then you're in a situation that you have them in another league and you just cannot give them away. So it will matter across leagues. And I think when Shawn said about the actual focus of the drafters in this, maybe if they are all looking to do the same objective of trading back and to stockpile those future picks and to build out those picks through, that round 5 to 10 range, there is going to be challenges with that. And maybe the price then, if we're looking at what it's worth, it's only worth what somebody's willing to pay. And if you have 11 other people in the league trying to do the same thing, nobody may be willing to pay to move up in the same way. What is positive is we are currently, the draft has just kicked off. It's an 8-hour clock. We are in a situation where the 101 is on the clock. So depending then, Shawn, if there's any moves made on those picks, that then could set the precedent for us at the 105. So we are a long way away, I think, from making that decision. It's not an offer that we're saying we have to take at this point. But if it's a case that there's no trades prior to it getting to us at the 105, maybe it is a case that it's going to be harder and harder to move down. But if we see somebody move up for a Josh Allen or a Jalen Hurts, maybe then that changes the picture significantly. At the 105, you are kind of looking, in this format at the quarterbacks, CJ Stroud, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes. Then you get into CD Lamb, Caleb Williams. If you have somebody that really wants to get up for the last of that tier of quarterback, let's say all 4 quarterbacks have gone, somebody really wants to get Williams or Daniels or CD Lamb, you may then, when you're on the clock, get an offer that is more appealing or more appetizing. The part of that you kind of hinted at is if everyone is kind of going in the same direction to try and, rather than give up the future capital, work back and get the future capital, it could become a case where that action is harder and harder to do, and we have to reevaluate what that trade offer is giving. So it's not a case where I would reject it. It's one of those ones where I would let the time tick down, and even with the offer that has been given, and this is where myself and yourself sometimes with the offers can maybe not fully agree, is that I sometimes think that you just take what is there at the time on the board, where I'll be interested when we get to the point if that small win of the extra capital for next season is enough. Sometimes I feel like it mightn't be enough for me to accept, but in those cases, and I tend to then say that Shawn's usually right on these situations, to defer to the the additional capital, because the one thing you never really regret is having, you know, additional second and third round picks the future year. It's not something that you really regret, but at the time, giving up that little bit of a downside. The other part, Shawn, it may not be what you look to get in this sort of situation in a startup, but when you look at like the 112, which we in play in this, you are into the area where you can get Bijan Robinson in general in this format, then Sam Laporta, Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Amon Ra, Garrett Wilson, Trey McBride. Like there's names there where if you're at the turn there, you are still open to a lot of talent in that 1-2 turn range. So you may be willing to pick up those extra pieces and then still pick them up. The advantage of being at 5 rather than 8 is when you're at 5, you're still very much in contention for the tail end of that quarterback tier, which we may have to redact this from the podcast, but I'm not necessarily having to have. So if I, you know, my goal here is to move back. But at the same time, it does dangle that carrot for somebody who really wants to have that QB1 in their team in a super flex format.
And so you look at the Dynasty ADP, Josh Allen, number 1, Patrick Mahomes, number 2, CJ Stroud, 3, Jalen Hurts, 4, and Lamar Jackson, 5. Those are the QBs that go before you get the 3 elite receivers. Colm, in my rankings and reflecting what you just said, I have Lamar Jackson at the 2-3 turn instead. A couple of other QBs that are ranked or are priced at the 110 and the 111 in Anthony Richardson and Joe Burrow, I have them in round 3 as well. And that's not something where it's trying to take an aggressive stand to say these guys are bad or that they're bad selections. It's simply saying, I also like the other players in this range in the first 3 rounds. I think the first 3 rounds are deep enough that you want to understand the risks of those QBs. So it's not a thing of a strong sell for the quarterbacks. It's a mixed element of also believing in the other players. But there are some QBs in that general range that are interesting, in a Jordan Love, a Jaden Daniels, Caleb Williams as the other first round QB there that we do still have in the first round. And as you're trying to work through what might happen in an unusual draft room, I think that we want to assume a little bit of a mix, right? We might expect Lamar Jackson to fall a little bit. We might expect Joe Burrow to fall. I don't think that we're going to see Anthony Richardson fall. There's almost always going to be someone who believes in his upside, and that person may be right. Okay. So I think that he is going to go in this range, regardless of what my rankings say. And so you're going to see some differences, but you're going to mostly see the players still go. And that's what we tend to see in the listener leagues that we do for Best Ball as well, which is that there's kind of a combination of the rankings and ADP. And so you see a structure that's a lot closer to what the RotoViz tools tell you to do. You see player selection that reflects the rankings in a much greater way than ADP does. And yet it doesn't go all the way to that point. If it did, then we would see the quarterbacks fall and fall and fall, which people are going to tend to want those QBs. So I do think that we can move back. And even if we move back and missed on our targets, then you're still going to get somebody good at the 112. And so the specific trade offer was for a 2, 3, and a 4 in the future in order to move up those 7 slots. In most cases, what I tend to see in these drafts is that if you have a pick in the top, 2, 3, 4, 5 spots, and someone who gets, unfortunately, a bad spot, that 11, 12 sort of range wants to move up, they've got to pay a first round pick for it. Yeah. And that part I think is tough because one of the things that we love about Superflex and love about the RotoViz Triflex leagues is that these should be flatter drafts, flatter startups, to where the teams that draw the 9, 10, 11, 12 don't suffer this massive penalty. So,
and I guess to highlight that, just from when we're talking through it, the Triflex format is one where you start 3 wide receivers, but have 3 flex spots. So it's 1 quarterback, and then you have the option of, one of those flexes being a quarterback spot, but it's also tight end premium. And as I mentioned, you have to start 3 wide receivers. So it kind of balances out all those positions. The other interesting thing when you're doing these startup drafts, Shawn, to highlight, I guess, for people is you can only draft 3 quarterbacks in the startup draft. So you cannot draft additional ones, which then means that if you pass on quarterback in those opening rounds, they're not all going to be gone because people are capped at the amount that they can take. So waiting on quarterback could still, although you're not getting the elite options, can be advantageous to, if you're going to try and build it out through the other positions. So as you mentioned, even that late spot, there is opportunities to do other things. And if I feel if I was at the 112, I don't know if, obviously if an opportunity come up for a player that you wanted to really move up for that maybe fell a little bit, you could move up. But I would be willing to kind of sit there or even potentially try and move back again to make up for the draft spot that way rather than, trying to reach up this year and pay up for them future seasons. Which way would you prefer to do it, even if you had that 112 spot?
I like continuing to move back, and yet I think that you have to consider in this league where a lot of managers are going to try and build long-term juggernauts, how much advantage is there kind of baked into being the contrarian participant? A lot of times what we see with contrarian participants is that they do have good teams in year one. Now, the risk is that if you don't flat out win, you don't make up enough ground to have it really pay off. But in a big chunk of the drafts that I'm in or the leagues that I'm in, the contrarian drafter will have finished in the top couple spots in year one. And they are then, very, I wouldn't say full of themselves exactly, but there's a strut going into year two where they're like, it's already worked for us. Like everything else now is gravy. So I think you want to be aware of what you might be able to accomplish by going win now in a league where a lot of drafters are not going to be doing it quite that way. And I also think that the people in our particular league, obviously I'm biased, so it's not, I'm going to be pumping up our 11 competitors. And yet, again, I'm biased, so listeners know that. I think that people who take a contrarian approach in this league are going to execute it well to where they're even more dangerous in this league than they would be in most leagues because they're going to figure out the best possible path to do it to where a lot of these teams, say we have 3 teams. Here's my guess. We're going to have 2 teams that are like straightforward, like blatant, brutal tank and are going to be pointing to years 3 and 4. You're going to have 5 or 6 teams that are pointing to year 2 and kind of the long term. You're going to have several teams that are kind of moving in that vague win now direction, but still selecting very young players. And then maybe you have maybe 1, maybe 2 teams that see this as an opportunity to really draft a roster that if you had that roster in redraft, you'd say, well, there has been some kind of collusion, right? Because it's just too good. It's utterly dominant. And that's the kind of roster you can put together in a startup if you correctly guess how your opponents are going to play it and then you execute yourself. So if we have that type of mix, then, moving up from the 12 to the 5, getting the player that you like there, getting a couple of foundation quarterbacks, getting some win now running backs, drafting really strongly from a receiver perspective, where maybe you don't have stars, but you can fill that out. You've got a very good starting lineup. And the trade that we have here is one where those 2, 3, 4 picks in the future don't necessarily hurt that drafter much at all for the, for the startup. And they keep their first round pick, so maybe doesn't even hurt them that much in the future. If they execute properly and they win, then you're trading the 212, the 312, the 412 to make a big jump up. And one of the things that you do see there, and one of the reasons why I've mentioned it's hard to make that trade and not get a first round pick back, is that when we look at the tiers, there are only 8 guys in tier 1. And so you're going to be moving down in all likelihood. And the 8 guys are not very controversial. Those 8 guys will go before we get on the clock at 12. With that being
They'll
the case,
be the first 8 guys that go. Like, it might be a different order, but they'll be gone.
I mean, I have Lamar Jackson in the second tier. He could intrude on that. There are some other possibilities, but yeah, I don't think there's really any scenario in which the top 8 make it to us at pick 12. So you're going to give up meaningful value because that drop down from tier 1 to tier 2, I mean, it's a huge break, which again is one of the reasons that you demand a first round pick in order to move down. Or you could do something as well. I mean, this drafter, if they execute the trade, will then also have the 201. It's not just future picks that you want to be involved here. You also want to make some moves within the rest of the draft. That would be something in terms of the counter offer that would be interesting.
You also mentioned, going in and leaning in if you're at the later spot to try and get that big piece. And obviously the difference there is you have a team in a league where it's not necessarily a 1 in 12 chance, but there's 12 teams and you're one of them. But they could win. But obviously if you do miss, if you're giving up that future first, it does make a big difference, because then you're kind of battling uphill if that player that you take with that pick that you've given up a future first for, you're kind of battling uphill then for a season or so to try and get things back on track if the rest of your draft hasn't all clicked into place as well. But the other thing that could happen in this, we do see it in best ball drafts that we do together with the listeners as well, some of the players that will fall, and that, when you're looking at win now players, some of the players I think that will probably fall more than others in this draft are some of those win now names. When you start to look into more veteran players, some of the running backs that may even slip down a little bit, even some of the tight ends maybe that may slip through from some of those more veteran guys in this draft. Is that something where I don't know if you can call that contrarian, but is like taking some of those names maybe a way to play it? Or because a little bit like the article that we had recently from Michael Dubner, where he was talking about being the avalanche in those best ball rooms, when it's a case that the running backs in that situation are falling, you have to continue to draft the wide receivers in a room like this where people are going to try and build out young teams that are going to have perpetual reloading windows. And then you also know that people may not be as interested in some of those veteran names, whether it's trading them this offseason or trading them next year. Is that like a landmine that you think that you need to avoid, that you're not drafting somebody who may only be maybe 27 now, for example, or even if you look at like a Tyreek Hill as they move on, that you just may have to hold them the rest of the way, and you may never get that return on investment in a trade scenario for, let's say, a Hill or maybe even an AJ Brown coming into conversation there, and they're going, for example, in the third round by ADP. Even running backs, maybe Jonathan Taylor, certainly Christian McCaffrey, the people are not willing to move back out of those guys or move into them in the future if you're trying to trade them away. And they're all, as I mentioned, they're third round players by current ADP in this particular format. But what would your thoughts be on either leaning in or steering clear of that in this sort of situation?
Yeah, and I think we want to make this even more widely applicable as well, where we probably have some listeners who are like, I'm not in that league, I'm going to be in normal leagues. What should I do?
I don't care.
And yeah, the thing that you want to look at when you're building a win now team is how much advantage will that player really give me to win now? Because just like in redraft, the older players can be better picks than the sort of, I mean, this may sound weird, but like if you're an aging peak window player and you're not that good, then those are the guys you want to avoid at all costs. Now, you're not going to always be right. Sometimes
so old bad players, don't draft old bad players.
Well, but what I'm looking at are players who
are on the brink of just disappearing. Their value is going to collapse.
So we look at the ADP in this format, and Saquon Barkley is the 502. Kyron Williams is the 510. That is really weird because, yes, the Rams have added Blake Corum. There's the possibility for that to cause problems for him, but Saquon Barkley's peripherals are already bad. Will Shipley is probably better than Blake Corum is. And if you're right on Saquon Barkley, what you win is really very minimal. And maybe people will win on that. But again, like, how much are you going to win by making that play? Whereas if Kyren Williams comes out and the foot is actually not a problem, he's going to score a lot of points this year, and he's going to score a lot of points for a while. You can win much bigger on Kyren Williams, and he is the cheaper player. You kind of work through there. Somewhat surprisingly to me, Jonathan Brooks is going after both of those guys. He should probably be going before both of them. Then you have Kenneth Walker, James Cook, Isaiah Pacheco in 6. Right? Isaiah Pacheco is not an older player, but how much do you win when you draft someone who has not been particularly good? And the age element doesn't really provide a meaningful moat. The next guy, Josh Jacobs. Why would you pick Jacobs there? He's been mostly bad throughout his NFL career. And if you're right, what do you win by selecting Jacobs? You move through Rachaad White, 704. Even if you're trying to win now, is that a good pick? You're talking about a player who's in the peak window, and yet what they're likely to give you in 2024 in terms of points over what you get from a random fill-in player is probably not going to be there. Whereas you move to the 801 and you get Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry, from everything that we know, is still a star, and he's going to be a star in a Baltimore Ravens offense that could make him, worthy of a second round redraft pick. That's the type of player where the ability for them to actually make a difference in the current year is worth so much more than younger players who will probably never make a meaningful league-winning difference ever again. And so if Derrick Henry in our draft falls from the 801 to, say, the middle of 10, which seems very possible, and you're in that win now mode, pick him, because what he does for you makes the difference. And that's the question that you want to continue to ask yourself as you move through these picks. It's like DeAndre Swift in the middle of 8. How much difference is he going to really make? Even if he hits, and we like DeAndre Swift, there are other backs in that offense. The offense probably won't be that great for the running back position. Not a good selection. And you can continue to ask that question as you move through. And when you find veterans who are discounted specifically because they're veterans, but will help you win this season, you want to be aware of why that still is very important, even in Dynasty. And you want to understand how the trade values of different positions are going to work, because one of the problems that you have with all of these running backs that I've mentioned is that unless they actually hit a very high-end outcome, you will never have the ability to trade them. And so you're taking a guy who doesn't really make a difference for you, and you are then going to ride them to zero.
But you're also having to take those and, the 8th round if you're taking them at IDP, or the 7th round for some of those names that you mentioned. And that is the part as well of, like, maybe if you do trade back and you've gathered up those additional picks in that range, maybe that doesn't feel as, damaging to your future team, because you can try and get them into a good place for this particular season. But the part that you mentioned, Shawn, is if Derrick Henry's going 2 rounds later, which he may in our draft based on what we're kind of talking through here. But in general drafts, that's not going to be the case. But when you look through the names that you have mentioned, like backing all that up, my conversation then would go into, if you're in a draft where it's not Derrick Henry falling 2 rounds and it is Saquon Barkley falls a round, like, I'm going to be interested in where the points of this draft are, where people are like, well, he's normally, the 501, but he's going here at the 608. Like, I have to take him at that point. There's too much. And we kind of hope that people aren't listening to the show before they draft against us, but realistically, kind of what we're nearly saying is that he just needs to continue to fall. You need to take the other players over him. And that's then when you're looking at the profiles again of the players who could ascend up this, like, you really don't want to be drafting any players that when you look into 2025, that they really have no path to going up the board. Like, even Derrick Henry, if he had a 18 touchdown season this year, next year he's still going to be looked at as a veteran who has another year of a lot of work under him. he's not going to jump back up into the 4th or 5th round. He's probably going to stay where he is, even with that big season. The only thing that a lot of these players like Joe Mixon, for example, or Pacheco, you mentioned, certainly Saquon Barkley, the only thing a big season can do for them is hold them where they are to stop them losing value. It's going to be very hard for them to get on that part where their trajectory of value moves up again. And that's kind of probably, when it comes down to it, the exact reason that you don't want to be drafting those guys, because they're not going to allow you to reinvest that cost or sell that player to then move into the perpetual reloading window where you have those additional parts of capital, whether it's draft picks or being able to move them into players, and your team is going to kind of slowly continue to decline.
That's a great way to explain that and make sure that folks understand what will happen to the roster. One of the things I've been thinking about here that I do think is potentially a viable approach is to go with a hybrid attack where you trade down, but you then target veteran players. And there is going to be some tension within the approach, because in some ways you're working at cross purposes. But if, as you move down, you are then taking players who in redraft would be more expensive, and you're generating some additional pick value for yourself in the future to replace some of those guys who miss, I think that we can get in too narrow a mindset about Dynasty, where everything is either, okay, I'm trying to win now, or I'm trying to win 10 years from now, and forget that there are other ways to approach it. That's one of the things that we really like to emphasize with the perpetual reloading and the permanent championship window, is that you want to build a team where your window is always open, but Colm, you also want to show flexibility within even that type of mindset. There's more than one way to get there. And one of the ways to accomplish it, and one of the things that's fun about Dynasty that is different than redraft, is that you are going to have, again, unless you have like 60, 70 teams, there are some Dynasty enthusiasts out there. There are some Dynasty communities that are really sort of targeted toward folks who are drafting 60, 70, 80 teams. And then, you do get a little bit more of a portfolio perspective. But I love having, somewhere in that range of 8 to 20 teams, which is still a lot, right? It's a lot to manage. But when you have somewhere between 5 and 20 teams, you're really looking to get the guys that you think are going to make those teams dominant. One of the reasons why I don't think that we're going to see people catching the falling knives in this Dynasty league, whereas when we do our listener leagues for Best Ball, you do see it some, is that in Best Ball, when you do it and you catch the blade, you're like, okay, well, that just only hurt me for this limited time period. In Dynasty, that mistake is going to sit with you and sit with you. So I think we're going to see some big fallers. We're going to see some big risers. That part is a lot of fun. I would encourage folks that if you missed the opportunity to be involved in this league, that you reach out to other members of the OT community that you've struck up relationships with and see if there's the possibility to be in a league together sometime between now and the beginning of the season. Colm, we also want to do a tiny little bit of Dynasty Reanimators to close out the show. We have a listener question.
Yeah, and I think this fits in perfect with kind of a little bit what we were talking about, because there's a couple of veteran players that are going to join the discussion here. And the part, Shawn, I was kind of visualizing when you were talking about the falling knife, and I was wondering, like, if a player falls 5 rounds, is there a certain point where the knife is not going to cut your hand as bad? But I couldn't think of a funny way to work that in. So we'll go into the listener question. This one comes in from Sakar, and he's looking about some advice on the wide receivers, but it is an extremely tight end premium league. He mentioned it's 0.5 points PPR and 0.5 points per first down, but then tight ends get an additional 1 PPR and an additional 0.5 for a first down. So lots of different intricacies there. Shawn, the Scott Fish Bowl obviously been drafted over the last couple of weeks, finished up my draft over the last couple of days, and I'm in a couple of other charity leagues where there's all sorts of wild additions for certain positions. So fun seeing some of these then go into the dynasty element of it. He says he has great wide receivers, great quarterbacks, great tight ends, but feel his wide receivers are not up to par. As he doesn't have any 2025 picks, he sent his first plus Christian Kirk for Tua. Does he need to fix his wide receivers? The question here, Shawn, it's going to be a big one for you. Can he trust Amari Cooper and Devontae Adams? How can he reload the team? So the roster is very shallow, and another injury to Jonathan Taylor or Mark Andrews could cost him the championship as it did last year. So the team is Jalen Hurts, Jonathan Taylor, Jamar Gibbs, Devontae Adams, Amari Cooper, Hollywood Brown, Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, Rashee Rice, Bijan Robinson, Tua, Jacoby Brissett, Desmond Ridder, Aiden O'Connell, Tyler Heineke. Then it does get a little bit less here in terms of the running backs. We have Royce Freeman, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Trey Sermon, Greg Darts, Trey Palmer, Romeo Dobbs, Brian Thomas, Troy Franklin, Tim Patrick, Joan Jennings, Joan Johnson, Hayden Hurst, Davis Allen, and Josh Oliver. So we are looking at, the depth isn't as much there. There's some really strong players at the top end, but even some of those top end players then are in the veteran side of things. Even if we're looking at, can you trust Amari Cooper and Devontae Adams? I think you need to kind of factor in a little bit with the Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce side of things. Even though they're at the high end of the tight ends, they're kind of leaning towards that curve with Travis Kelce beyond in terms of the age curve. So they are also players that their value could drop off significantly. Like, you talk about an injury to Jonathan Taylor or Andrews, but an injury to Travis Kelce could be, a dagger for his dynasty value. And he's another player that, even with huge seasons and, a Hall of Fame career, he's likely to continue to, decline in value over the coming season. So I would slot him in as well to the can you trust players. Then we're also looking at, maybe how to fill out some depth. So there's a good roster overall, but it is top heavy and also a little bit veteran heavy as well. Shawn, can he trust? I don't think Shawn can ever trust Amari Cooper, but Amari Cooper, Devontae Adams, and how do you feel then about even the other veterans on the roster to go along with that?
So this is one where I do want to just say before we start that I've been below the market on Adams and Cooper. And so I think that you need to factor that in anything I say on those two players, that you're not getting, biased or unbiased is probably not quite the way to look at it. But if you're going to ask somebody who has those players below the market, they're probably going to say to sell. Whereas
that, I think that also shows that that there is still, I think, a market for those players.
There is. And that's the thing I wanted to note is the Devontae Adams. So in our format, which isn't going to be the same, but it does give you a feel for how players are being valued. Devontae Adams is wide receiver 33. He's in the middle of round 7. Amari Cooper is wide receiver 41. He's at the end of round 9. Now, when we think about that from the perspective of the receiver market, I would prefer to have Deontay Johnson, who is wide receiver 45. And one of the elements there is that even if I'm wrong, when you're moving down and getting a less expensive receiver, you're building in some extra risk management and you're potentially building depth to your roster, right? Another interesting player that maybe you could get as part of some type of a 2-for-2 where you move Adams and then a weak piece. Maybe you get back Deontay Johnson at Adonai Mitchell. And so you then mix the types of profile that you have where Deontay helps you try and accomplish this objective of winning now because this team is set up to do that. Whereas Mitchell can give you that potential breakout candidate to balance the decline of the veteran receivers. Somebody else who I think is interesting because maybe you could play the same type of thesis and pay a lot less is Keenan Allen as wide receiver 50. I personally don't think that there's a big difference between Adams at wide receiver 33 and Allen at wide receiver 50 in terms of what we can probably expect. Now, Allen has more target competition, but he also likely has a lot better quarterback play. We don't really know, right? Caleb Williams and what he's going to do versus these guys competing for the starting job with the Raiders. That's very open-ended in terms of what might happen. And anytime that you have, again, that sort of wide range, it's also a context in which you might like to choose the less expensive player, because if you have a very wide range, none of the guys are really locked into a specific outcome. Now, we know that players are never locked into a specific outcome because injuries play such a big role in all that type of thing as well. But moving down will allow you to, again, take a similar receiving profile and minimize or manage your risk. So those are some names that I would look at.
And also, Shawn, I know the part that you're saying is correct, but for a team like this, it also gives you a depth piece as well. So you would be adding in not just a younger player and Mitchell, for example, but you're also adding in potential depth, which is another need for the team.
Exactly. And you're going to be wrong sometimes. You have to be comfortable occasionally being wrong. But Dynasty is a really fun format because you can look at the prices and you can then try and find guys who offer the same basic either profile or range of outcomes or upside scoring level or floor scoring level, whatever it is that your team needs. You can find a cheaper version of that and try and make a trade that builds your overall depth. Again, it's not going to always work. In some cases, the player that you traded for was cheaper because they really just weren't going to score as well. Right. The player's worse. But you get to make that choice, right? You don't have to take random guys. You can look through and find exploitable opportunities. I do think that it can be tough, even when you have a startup market that has Adams where he is, that I mentioned, Cooper where he is. I think moving those guys can sometimes be tougher, even if the startup values would suggest that there is a market for them. So we want to understand that there's only a specific type of opposing manager who's going to be willing to even consider those guys. That is troubling as you try and put together these trades. But that's one of the reasons why I mention guys who are not trendy. If you try and take someone like a Devontae Adams or an Amari Cooper and move them for a trendy player, you're going to get auto rejects. But if you try and move them for a Deontay Johnson, for a Keenan Allen, that type of guy, you've got a much better chance of being able to make the move. If you're really gutsy, you could try and move them for players like Cortland Sutton and DeAndre Hopkins. Now, I think that you would, in that kind of 2 for 2, your second piece should be pretty weak, and the second piece that you get back should be pretty strong. I don't like those moves as much, but there may be listeners out there who are pretty high on Cortland Sutton, pretty high on DeAndre Hopkins. Those guys are both being valued in round 13, which means that if you were to move an Adams or move a Cooper, you should get quite a bit back. A lot of different possibilities. I think that I would try and move those players. One of the things you can do too, I mean, Mark Andrews is an interesting name because we did a full show on Christian McCaffrey and how you kind of have to ride him to zero because you can't replace those points. I think Andrews is kind of the tight end version of that. And yet, if you were able to find a team that had a Brock Bowers or a Dalton Kincaid or a Kyle Pitts, these are players who are more expensive in Dynasty than Andrews is. In most of those cases, I think that Kincaid's going to outscore him. But in those other names probably are more risky for the current season, but they're more likely to hold their value. Maybe you could move Andrews and Devontae Adams in a package for a Dalton Kincaid and a Keenan Allen. That would be the type of way that you would think about that move, where you could get off of the Andrews landmine. You get a better tight end. You could also move Devontae Adams, and you're taking a player who's a lesser player, but a similar profile. Colm, those are some different scenarios you might consider as you're looking at this roster and similar types of rosters.
Yeah, and the other part just to mention, I did mention Kelsey as well. There is a it's definitely substantial. There's a 6-year age difference. We have Mark Andrews 28. He's going to be 29 in September, but Travis Kelsey's 34. He's going to be 35 in October. You're looking at situations there where by current ADP, Kelsey is a tight end 8, Mark Andrews is a tight end 6. I think this season maybe that last opportunity with Kelsey going in the 6th round and Andrews going in the 5th round, that you have a chance to really get out off Kelsey with a significant portion of value coming back your way. And we won't dive into it fully, Shawn. I think we've kind of given a lot of ways that this can be attacked, but there is a lot of running back depth in this roster with Gibbs, Robinson, and Taylor. But he did do the trade for Tua. There's not really anything behind. Obviously, I think Aidan O'Connell has a chance to get work this year, and you've mentioned Brissett being the possible starter in New England to start the season. But Jalen Hurts, in terms of we're looking at dynasty assets, I don't think we should really skip over the fact that he, by ADP, is generally the QB4, but that is the 104 in startups. There's a massive amount of capital you could get back for potentially moving a Jalen Hurts for maybe a lesser ranked quarterback, but also the picks or the players that might go along with that. So maybe moving some of the strength at quarterback position out could allow you to facilitate that depth as well and build out the rest of the roster. So I just wanted to mention it. If you have any further thoughts, Shawn, we can go into it, but just wanted to pass that along in case some people, I think, look at their rosters in Superflex and think, well, I have my 2 quarterbacks now, I'm good. But sometimes moving out of those quarterbacks is what really pushes your team into a true contender.
Yeah, and it depends on how much of a swashbuckler you are. Sometimes that works for you. Sometimes it works against you. You can move Jalen Hurts for a Jaden Daniels and get a lot back, at least by ADP. I like those guys really fairly similarly, but that's within the context of Jaden Daniels has this massive range of potential outcomes. Yeah. All the way down to being like a Bryce Young, where the bottom completely falls out. If you were to make a trade like that and then you felt like you had ruined your roster for a decade and now you can't really ever enjoy this league, you want to think through, because that's a huge problem, right? It's not like that's just going to go away. It's a dynasty league. It's going to sit with you and sit with you and sit with you.
I hope Shawn, the advice I'm after giving out about trading Jalen Hurts doesn't end this person's love of the NFL completely.
Yeah, so trade Jalen Hurts and stop watching NFL football. Yeah. Stop playing fantasy. Colm, the other little note there, you mentioned Travis Kelce's age. He is still much more expensive than George Kittle. George Kittle also not young at 30, but
it is a big difference. 5 years in Dynasty, like half a decade is. I'm 35 now. If I could be 30 again, I probably wouldn't have the same pains on my back and hips that I do currently.
Well, and there's going to be a different aging element for NFL players than for normal people.
I'm not comparing myself to Travis Kelce.
Well, you're 6'6", like 15 stone. What's the stone?
I don't know the conversion, again? But I'm down now to just under 111 kg. Again, that's not going to help people to translate to pounds, but
okay.
I'm trying to get down, Shawn. It's not working. It's taking a long time.
Well, anyway, we get back to this question. One of the things I do want to mention is that even though George Kittle also a star, and we have seen tight end stars age very well compared to other positions, once these guys get to 30, it's on a year-by-year basis, so it's not really the same thing of gaining all of those years. You have to heavily discount what you're really gaining from a year's perspective, and yet in a best-case scenario, you would gain all of those years. You're unlikely to get that. But those are some other things that you want to at least think through. I would have George Kittle and Travis Kelce in a pretty similar spot for just 2024 scoring. And if you have that, then that's another additional reason that with this, more than 2-round difference in value between Kelce and Kittle, you want to keep that in mind. You want to look for as many little ways as possible to make your team stronger. Colm, we're really fired up about the RV Triflex Listener League, and we're hoping that everyone is enjoying their own dynasty startups, their dynasty trades, and their dynasty competitions.
I agree. And the thing I've just come to the conclusion, Shawn, I was looking through this and working out the calculations as you were talking. I've just come to the conclusion that I'm basically Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce is going to turn, he's about to turn 35. I am 35. He's 6'4", which is 1.96 meters. I'm 6'6", Shawn, so just slightly bigger. He's 249 pounds. I'm 244. So we're basically the same pair. At this point, I'm waiting for Taylor Swift to give me a phone call.
You would show up in the RotoViz Workout Explorer as a very close comp for Travis Kelce.
Yeah, if we take the athletic testing out of consideration, probably I would for height and weight. But we'll leave it at that because we're going to get off the rails if we continue to discuss these things. But that was a fun show talking through some Dynasty Startup and then Dynasty roster building strategy. If you are interested in signing up over at rotoviz.com to get access to all of the tools and the content, Shawn has lots of pieces coming out over the last couple of weeks, and I know that's just going to get more and more. The Zero RB list will be here before you know it, and lots of great other content being written up on the website, including Dave Cabin looking through some of his projections for the 2024 season. Use the code RVRadio2024 at checkout, save yourself 10% off a RotoViz NFL pass. Make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast. You'll get it once it is available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtomorrow, and my co-host is Shawn Siegele. As I mentioned, check his work out on rotoviz.com. And until next time, have a good one.